Misery is remembered as a tense psychological thriller, a story about obsession, control, and captivity. But what most people don't realize is this: the version of Misery we know is not the most disturbing one. Early drafts, production notes, and Stephen King's own comments suggest a version that went much further, a version the filmmakers deliberately pulled back from. Not because it wouldn't work, but because it might work too well. Now, we're opening the Misery file, before the final cut. On the surface, Misery is simple. A writer survives a car crash. He's rescued by a fan. That fan turns out to be dangerously unstable. Annie Wilkes is terrifying, but controlled. The violence is sharp, but limited. The horror is psychological. Audiences leave disturbed, but not destroyed. And that balance was intentional, because from the very beginning, the creative team knew something. This story had a breaking point. Cross it, and the film would become unbearable. But where exactly was that line, and how close to the original version come to crossing it? Stephen King's novel Misery is far more explicit, not just in violence, but in control, humiliation, and psychological domination. In the book, Annie doesn't just imprison Paul, she systematically dismantles him. She forces him to destroy his own work, rewrite under threat, internalize her approval as survival. Early screenplay drafts leaned heavily into this. According to interviews, the first adaptations portrayed Annie as less quirky and far more methodical, less explosive, more calculating. Producers reportedly worried about one thing in particular. If Annie became too real, the audience wouldn't see a villain. They would see something closer to reality, and that terrified them. Several moments from the novel were either changed or removed entirely. Not because they didn't fit the story, but because they changed how the audience related to Paul. In early drafts, Annie's punishments lasted longer. Paul's resistance broke more visibly. His compliance became psychological, not just physical. There are references to scenes where Paul begins to anticipate Annie's moods, adjusting his behavior before she even speaks. That dynamic was partially removed. Why? Because it shifts the story from survival to something more disturbing, conditioning. And that wasn't a story the studio wanted to tell. The film's ending is cathartic. Paul fights back, Annie is defeated, order is restored. But earlier versions of the ending were colder. In one proposed cut, Paul survives physically, but is permanently altered psychologically. Notes describe him as unable to write without fear, haunted by Annie's voice, questioning whether his success was worth the cost. This ending was considered accurate, but also emotionally devastating. Test audiences reportedly reacted with silence, not applause, not relief, just silence. And silence in Hollywood is a warning sign. The filmmakers made a choice. They kept the tension, they kept the fear, but they softened the psychological collapse. Because Misery wasn't just about obsession, it was about creative dependency, emotional imprisonment, the terror of being needed by the wrong person. Push that too far, and the story stops being entertainment. It becomes confrontation. The final version of Misery walks a careful line, close enough to disturb, far enough to let you breathe. So here's the real question. Would Misery be remembered as a classic or as something unwatchable if the darker version had survived? And how many stories like this are rewritten, not because they're bad, but because they're too honest? Subscribe to Before the Final Cut, where we explore the stories that were changed before they broke the audience.